Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another edition of the Morphinominal Hockey Show. It is I, Mike, and I am being joined. He's the author of Red Rising and covers the Capitals for Hockey Hot Stove, and sometimes he just needs a hug, but we did get our hug before the Olympic break. He is our good friend, Mr.
That is
Ted
true.
Starkey. How's it going,
How's it
Ted?
going? It goes. Olympics are over. Trade deadline's upon us, so it's an interesting week.
Yep. But before we hop into that, I mentioned before the Olympic break, we got to see each other, we got to chat for a bit, we got our hug. Well overdue hug. We've been joking about it on the podcast for months now, but we made it happen. But obviously, it's been very well documented that I just don't care about the Olympics.
I've heard.
However, and it's funny because I did a post. You sent me my own post and you made a joke, and it's like, I made the post. I could take the heat, and stuff like that, or I could take the joke as well. Um, well, one of our mutual friends, Scott, he sent me a text and he was like, serious question, considering how much I don't like the NHL players going to the Olympics, why am I even bothering sending him or others certain content that was from the Olympics? And uh, Ted, you and I were just talking about this before we hit record. The thing that we were talking about was about the plushies that were handed out to all the medalists. And I loved the look on Nathan McKinnon's face when he got his. And I loved the fake Italian police report on the homicide of plushies. I just thought it was funny. So there's two parts to this answer. Number one, everyone's talking about the Olympics. So, like, you just can't avoid it 100%. Like, even though, granted, while all the games were being played, I was out doing Instacart deliveries, so I'm more focused on, making money to pay my bills. So I am legitimately not watching the games. But at the same time, when I get home and I scroll through like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that, or even TikTok, I see it. I just thought it was funny, and that's why I shared them because you can't deny when something's good and funny.
Right.
Um,
Well, it's always interesting to see. Like as I said, I was telling you before, I saw how they're handing out at every medal ceremony. I was wondering how it was going to go for the losers of the men's hockey final, how it was going to go, and it didn't disappoint.
no,
Although, like I was saying, that the Tina dolls are going for a couple $100 on eBay. They're hard to find in Milan, so should have put them on eBay. They've been all set.
well, what's crazier is I found out that apparently Samsung was one of the sponsors for the Olympics, and all the Olympians got these special limited edition Samsung flip smartphones, and they're going for like 3 grand,
Hmm.
like 3 4 grand on eBay and stuff like that. It's crazy. Um, then he does a follow-up question, and this is where you and I can really have more of a conversation. And he goes, "Let me ask you another question. Do you support the World Cup?" And my response to him in text was, when it's in September before the season, yes. If it shuts down the league like Four Nations or the Olympic does, no, I don't support that. Um, and he goes, well, it's not true. It does affect the season. It's like, yeah, it does because it's just a few extra games before you go into training camp and stuff like that. But you're not shutting down the league. And there are key times when the NHL should really be ramping up certain games. And actually, I came with some ideas when I was in the car, driving around doing Instacart every single day. There's literally a 13-day stretch where I was in my car every day doing Instacart, just to give that perspective to everybody. Um, and, you know, there's a comparable to certain things with shutting down leagues. And like you look at the PWHL, the PWHL work that into their thing because before the PWHL was big, and even when the NWHL/PHF was around, they would shut down for the Olympics or for the women's world championships, rivalry series, Frozen Four. They would always do that because they want to market that and make sure that those things get marketed. But even then, with PWHL now, the Olympics is still that marquee thing that everyone gets their true women's hockey content from and don't really know overseas per se that Hillary Knight, Sarah Fillier, Marie Philippe Poulin, Erin Ambrose, all these women's hockey players are in the PWHL. There's a legitimate women's league that is paying the players like the NHL pays the players. I mean, not at the same level, but it brings more eyes into that product. NHL doesn't bring more eyes into their product by shutting down for the Olympics and then, post coming out of it. Key point, the Seattle Torrent just set the US women's hockey attendance record over the weekend, beating what was set in January at Capital One Arena. And that is a direct result of coming out of the Olympics. The Montreal Victoire had another big attendance appearance for their stuff coming out of the Olympics. So it's a big thing. Then when you look at other sports, and I want to use soccer as the primary one on this one, they're always going to shut down for the World Cup of Soccer. And they're always going to shut down for the Olympics because that was always something that was kind of ingrained into those seasons and stuff like that, because MLS isn't the only one who shuts down. It's Premier League. It's the all the soccer leagues that do it for the World Cup and for Olympics. So it's like it's different sometimes when you also compare apples to oranges, but like I think like especially shutting down right before the Super Bowl happens, that next day after the Super Bowl, the NHL should really be putting out marquee matchups all week, like starting with that Monday. That's my feeling on that, because now the biggest competition that you deal with is out of the picture, and you need to really put your best product out there, like a Flyers Penguins game, Rangers Islanders, get those rival, like literally, could you imagine an entire week of just a focus of just rivalries, an entire rivalry week coming out of the Super Bowl? That would be great. So,
Well, basically, like the one thing I'll say about the World Cup in September is while it's better for a not even a health perspective because you will get guys hurt and they'll just miss camp. Uh, the numbers were never great. Like even when they had the Canada Cup playing in August and September, just because there's so much competition and no one's thinking about hockey at the tail end of summer. That's one thing that was surprising with last year's Four Nations, how good the ratings were, because, it became at a time where people were thinking about hockey, came and the end of football. So there's more interest in it. And I think the Olympics obviously are tied into NBC. And even though NBC, I don't think did as much to promote the NHL product as they had in previous years because they're no longer a rights holder. Obviously, the numbers from this past weekend were terrific. It was one of the highest ranked non-football pre 9 a.m. Telecasts in sports history. Obviously, I think you got to remember there's two reasons why the NHL agreed to this. One is to try to get exposure outside of the normal NHL circles, which they did. And two, it's to basically so they get a good, favorable CBA because this is a big chip that the players want to play in the Olympics and the owners don't. But they can negotiate a long ways getting players in the Olympics versus not. So, the World Cup, I think 2016, I think it was kind of a novelty how they put together Team North America and Team Europe, and it kind of ruined a lot of what the international part of the tournament is. But, it's hard to sell hockey in September. It really is. I mean, I think, like I said, the Canada Cups are some of the greatest hockey you'll ever see, but no one saw it because it wasn't really on anywhere. No one was paying attention to it. You're running up against baseball, football, college football, the end of summer, and it's a really hard time to sell anything. Whereas February, once you're coming off the NFL, it's a lot more visible, which is why the numbers. I said I was surprised Four Nations did as well as it was. I was not surprised at the Olympics how well it did because especially the United States doing well. But I think you're not going to have anything next year except for the All-Star game, which will probably be a big downer because no one wants to go back to the All-Star game anymore, but they're contractually obliged to. and then I presume that the World Cup is going to be in September, but it's up for debate because, like I said, I think the impact
Well,
outside is a lot greater doing in the middle of the season than doing before the season, just because of the way it is. Between that and the World Championships, they're good tournaments, but no one pays attention to them.
yeah, well, I mean, but the thing is that people are just going to have to get used to the fact that you're going to be getting hockey in September starting next season, regardless, because with the move to from the 82 game schedule to an 84 game schedule, the season is now going to be starting at the end of September instead of at the beginning of October, and that's one of the concessions that was made of moving from an 82 to an 84 game season, and also shortening the preseason from 6 to 7 games pending team to a straight up 4 game preseason for every team. So people are going to kind of have to get used to September hockey effectively this upcoming fall because of it. So it'll be interesting. But you mentioned the World Championships for men. That's during the Stanley Cup playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Most people. I mean, that's another reason why nobody's really paying attention to that one is because it's during the actual Stanley Cup playoffs. And just like with a World Cup, to the point of Scott, how it can affect a season regardless because of injuries or other things. Same with the World Championships you know, you know, in the docu-series I did on the 97-98 team, the Capitals didn't have Andre Nikolishin until about December, like mid to late December of the 97-98 season because he ended up blowing out his knee and needing surgery at the World Championships. So you're always going to have something like that. Ethan Bear, who is now with the Islanders organization, the reason he missed the first half of the season when he signed the first year of that 2 year deal with the Capitals was because he ended up injuring his shoulder at the World Championships as well. So there's always going to be the risks, with these tournaments. And like, luckily, as you and I had talked about with the Olympics, luckily, like the biggest extent of the injuries coming out of this one was obviously Kevin Fiala of the LA Kings being out now for the remainder of the season due to that freak, you know, accident with Tom Wilson, how they felt awkwardly and stuff like that, and he needed that surgery on his leg. Um, Sidney Crosby's out 4, maybe 6 weeks, and Mikko Rantanen is out a minimum of 2 weeks right now. So it's like it's not as bad as like say with the Four Nations where literal teams were missing key players for key periods of time,
Yeah, I
after the
think
fact.
I think I told you a lot before that I was surprised how vicious the Four Nations was for it was essentially a meaningless tournament. I mean, it was a lot of fun, but it wasn't like the Olympics or even the World Cup. It was, basically an NHL manufactured tournament, mini tournament, I should say. But some of the injuries with Charlie McAvoy, you know, Kachuk, some of these other guys were gone, and obviously McAvoy's got even stranger with the whole aftercare procedure that basically knocked him out. But the Olympics, obviously, the rules are a little bit stricter than the NHL in terms of obviously fighting. So you didn't have the sideshow you did last year in Four Nations between the Canada and the U.S. And I think obviously the Crosby injury was a bit of a fluke injury. Even he said afterwards it was a hockey play. Fiala obviously got hurt, but it wasn't. You didn't say the same kind of viciousness I thought as you did at the Four Nations, but it was less of an NHL style of game and more an international style of game. So, but yeah, it's always tricky when you had a September tournament because also you're getting guys coming off. You really don't have much camp. Obviously they would have their own country camp, and teams did not necessarily like that. Your stars were unavailable for most of camp, and then again, it's hard to say, but the reason the World Cup exists is because that's something the NHL can control. They control the revenue, they control the officials, they can control the rinks. The IOC does not share anything, as any people found with highlights. They were hard. The IOC is very militant about finding rogue highlights on Twitter and Facebook
It,
and all these other sources and track them down and eliminate them. So
it's
they're
so sad that when Macklin Celebrini scored his first goal in the Olympics, the NHL, the Sharks, and I believe it's called NBA Paint, which is an account, um, they had to come together and do an NBA Paint style
Yep.
highlight because they can't use the actual Olympic footage. And apparently, when the Olympics puts up their footage, it's only allowed to be up. I think I read something, it's only allowed to be up for 24 to 48 hours, and then it's pulled.
Hmm.
And,
Yeah.
so it's like, this is why, it's like you say you want to grow the game. One of my ideas that I came up with was instead of shutting down the NHL to send the players over, especially like in the case of Italy, where games were being played at 8 in the morning, 6 in the morning, 8 in the morning, 10 in the morning, 12 in the afternoon, or whatever, like what the latest was to go with their time zone over there. Because 2030, I believe, is in France. So you're going to have about the same type of times. I would send prospects that, from around the world, all the prospects, even those that are in the American League, and have them play on the big stage to see how they do. Utilize that as a way to say, this is the future of hockey playing at the Olympics. This is the future of what we'll see in the NHL and stuff like that. And then that evening, during the day you promote the future, and then at night you promote the present.
Well,
And
remember you had that in 2018 and 2022. You basically had AHL guys and prospects and college guys.
yeah,
So
but
everyone's seeing.
but the NHL didn't promote it that way though.
Well, it's not their product. I mean, that's the thing. It's you got to
But
remember
if you have your guys there, like your prospects and stuff like that, and you're trying to bill it as the future of the game, the
it
NHL
just
should be promoting that. The
it doesn't
PWHL did a better job of doing that than
it
than the
just doesn't,
NHL does.
the thing is it doesn't resonate the same. I mean, people get into it, but it doesn't resonate the
Yeah.
same. It just people won't watch it because it's not even like it used to be the college kids. It's a general tournament. It's basically that then if you talk about the world championships, it's actually a lower level than the world championships in terms of quality of play. The only equivalent you could have would probably be make the world juniors the Olympic tournament, but then they would never allow that either because that's such a moneymaker for TSN and the IAHF. So they would never move that tournament to February. So
Yeah. And it works
it's one
per
of
and that tournament works beautifully at the holiday season
yes,
too.
yeah,
So
no, it's a phenomenal tournament, and like as I said, it's one of those things they would never touch it because it's a cash cow for them, especially with the tournaments in Canada, and then TSN is they get monster. The one country that cares about the World Juniors more than anybody else is Canada. But whereas the Olympics, it's wrapped in with other the other products, and obviously what people are going to remember about this Olympics will be the hockey tournaments because when the U.S. doesn't do well, you remember other things like figure skating or some of the other events. But I mean, they've tried to work around this. I mean, I know there's been talk at some point maybe they move the hockey to the Summer Olympics, which your players are crazy about because then you're playing, you know,
almost
competitive
year
hockey.
round.
Yeah, and it's it doesn't. Originally it was part of the Summer Olympics, but it's logistically it's hard, and it's just one of those things. I think the NHL for years was hoping they would get this back with Canada and the US in the final, obviously with the ratings. And like I said, look at, this week, obviously the Hugheses have been around. Even the negative press about the phone call was, big news, which has never happened with the NHL. So, it's part of the conversation. And I think that's what they're
Well,
hoping for. And,
let's
and
be
like
honest.
I said, but
Let's be
before you, no, I'm going to say, but remember too, the reason it's here because the owners had it in the CBA and
Yeah.
they got a really good deal out of it. So they get, I know that all the owners complain about injuries and stuff like that, but they allowed this to happen because they knew they could get a lot of concessions in other areas. So they are not worse for wear for having this happen.
Yeah, but let's also be honest. You brought up the controversy in the men's locker room after they won the gold. You can flip this six ways the Sunday, one way or the other. The moment that Kash Patel, the FBI director, entered that locker room and started partying with the players, it became a political thing. And especially with him doing the phone call. Like obviously the phone call thing, that was a big thing that took place at the Four Nations thing too, which made it political as well. So once you kind of bring in those little bit of factors, you got to expect the backlash from it because they always say keep politics out of sports. Well, when you invite the FBI director to party with you and then he gets the president on the phone, you just invited politics into your locker room at that point.
Well,
Um,
remember though, in 1980, Walter Mondale was in the U.S. locker room too, and he got the phone call to Jimmy Carter.
but
So
the
that's,
difference with the '80s one and this one is that, because as we all saw with the movie Miracle and even with all the documentaries on that team, that was during a much more unique time frame where you're in the Cold War. And so, like, there was actually talk about boycotting the Olympics, like countries boycotting the Olympics over certain things, because I think the Soviets had just invaded a country leading up into the 1980 Olympics. So there's talk that the U.S. was going to boycott or other countries. So like the entire 1980 Olympics was straight up political from before it even started. Whereas this one, we could have kind of kept the politics out,
I mean, I think
you
the
know.
thing is, it's traditional in the U.S. for to basically, I think the men's team was kind of in a no-win situation because they either go to the White House, go to the State of the Union, and they're criticized for one side, and then if they skip, they're criticized the other way. So it's kind of like they're
Yeah.
put it between Patel and what was said on the phone call. I mean, the U.S. was kind of bystanders in that. I mean, obviously they reacted. That was probably not the best way to react, but I think at the same time, it's like who's going to tell the FBI director they can't come in, particularly when apparently it was
Garen.
Patel had the phone that Trump was going to call. So I'm sure he was like, "Oh, well, the president's going to call. I need to come in," and they're not going to kick him out anyway. Plus, he's a big hockey fan. I think his conduct in the locker room wasn't exactly the most professional, but again, that's not on the U.S. team. That's on Patel.
Oh
And
yeah.
then, and yeah, I mean, that's the thing too. I mean, I think it's interesting to see the reaction afterwards. And I think, you know,
I
obviously there are people who are going to be critical of whatever you do.
I
And, that's just a reality of today. And, it would have been interesting if 1980 would have happened in social media, like what the reaction would have been. Because obviously at that time, like you were saying, that, Russians invaded Afghanistan and the
that's
U.S.
what
had
it was,
already
yeah.
said they were going to boycott the Moscow Summer Games. So this is basically the only time the U.S. and the Soviet Union was going to go head to head in anything. I mean, there was talk before that Olympics, the Russians were going to boycott Lake Placid, but their kind of attitude was, we want to go in there and kick their whats.
Yeah.
So that was their attitude, but it was unfortunate. I mean, I think it wasn't handled the best by the U.S. team, but I also think it's a lot of it wasn't their own doing. It was kind of they were bystanders with what was going on, and maybe they didn't react as they should have. But at the same time, it's 20 years from now, no one's going to remember it. They're just going to remember the gold medal.
I'll say this. If Patel was in there just taking pictures, and we actually do know that it was general manager Bill Guerin who invited Patel into the locker room. Um, and if he was in there and he was just taking pictures of the players and like taking a picture with the medal, doing the phone call, and the phone call thing's normal because we've seen
Right.
presidents call teams to congratulate them on like their Stanley Cup, their Lombardi Trophy, the NBA. That's a natural thing that we've seen over and over in the years and never be political. It's just, oh, they're congratulating them. Obviously, the joke that he made about the women's team, Trump did, was very misogynistic. Um, like you said, they reacted very poorly to it. They should not have laughed at that. It was a really bad and tasteless joke. But, and this is how we're going to end this, and we're going to go right into the NHL stuff. At the end of the day, the women got the last laugh when Hillary Knight and Megan Keller were on Saturday Night Live with the Hughes brothers and heated rivalry star Connor Story, I believe his last name is. I have not watched the show yet. It is on my eventual to watch list. I want to see the show just so I can be part of the conversation a little bit better. And they made the joke of, well, we were originally going to have the spotlight, but we wanted to invite the guys, and they flipped the joke onto the guys. And so it's like, in a way, it's like, okay, you got them. We can kind of move forward, you know, in this moment for the women, who
Yeah.
deserve just as much flowers and were probably even much more dominant than the men's team were in the Olympics.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also have to remember too that the men throughout the tournament were very supportive of the women. I know one particular columnist we were familiar with was criticizing the men, and I looked over her career of covering Olympics, and I think she'd written about women's hockey once, and I can safely say I think the men's team had been in more women's games in Milan than this particular columnist who's criticizing them, saying they weren't paying attention to them. Had spent probably it probably seemed she admitted she saw the gold medal game for the women on TV. And so it's like, why are you criticizing them when you're supposedly you're going to bat for them, saying how important this was, yet you're not paying attention to it. And it was just I get with the whole political scene right now. I thought Patel, I don't have an issue with him in the locker room, but I do think he was obviously very unprofessional. But then again, that's like I said, that's something out of the team's control. You're not going to ask the FBI director to go chug beers and dancing in our locker room. I think most people aren't going to expect that to happen. But
Yeah.
like as I said, with the phone call, obviously, I mean, I guess it's one of those things where you have to expect something's gonna come out like that. But like I said, it's a locker room 10 minutes after the biggest victory for the United States since 1980. It's loud, it's boisterous, and who knows how many people really hear it. And I thought post the reaction afterwards, being contrite, I thought a lot of them did a good job. I thought Hughes did very well post Olympics and stuff like
Which
that. And
Hughes, Jack or Quinn?
Jack, yeah. No,
Jack.
I thought like his comments were pretty poignant, and I thought, as I said, it is what it is. I think the one thing in today's culture, it's like there's not a lot they could have done to avoid criticism one way or the other. And I think, obviously, I thought it was I didn't think it was unwarranted, but I also thought it was a little bit excessive in terms of the criticism because I thought, they reacted poorly, but it's not something I thought that was warranted the criticism they were getting. Trump is going to say random stuff. He's going to say off the color stuff. You kind of have to expect it. And, to be blunt, it's not the worst thing he's ever said. So it's not exactly like you can't not expect this anymore from him.
Yeah.
But, as I said, I thought it was, I thought they both sides did a good job afterwards. I thought yeah, said the men, and as I said, in the end, I think to think that the men didn't support the women's team, I think is totally off base because I think it's a complete opposite.
Yeah. So with that, we're going to end Olympic international talk, and we're going to go into NHL right now, because there's a lot to talk about this week for the NHL because Friday is the trade deadline. And there's a playoff race that's in place right now, and the Capitals literally only have 20 games left. And obviously, when this episode, we are recording this episode Monday, March 2nd, so this episode is being released Tuesday, March 3rd, hours before the Capitals take on the Utah Mammoth. Um, which, let's just put it, this game is probably going to be the most important game for the Capitals going into the trade deadline. They did their job coming out of the break. They won the first two games, but then they were unfortunately blown out by the Montreal Canadiens 6-2. But hey, if you're going to get blown out, at least get 2 goals from Alex Ovechkin. Might as well. Um, Looking at things right now, obviously Carolina's first in the Metropolitan Division with 82 points. We're really not going to be talking about them simply because, or in the cap sense of who they're chasing, because they pretty much have first place in the division locked down. Pittsburgh has 75 points, but they have uh, 3 games in hand on the Capitals. The New York Islanders also have 75 points, and they have 1 game in hand on the Capitals currently. But then when you look at the wild card, Detroit is at 74 points with 2 games in hand, and Boston has 71 points with 3 games in hand as well. The Capitals have 69 points, and underneath them is the Columbus Blue Jackets with 66 points, but with 4 games in hand on the Capitals. And the Senators have also 66 points with 3 games in hand. The Flyers are at 65 points with 3 games in hand. The Panthers have 63 points, as well as the Maple Leafs, and they both have 2 games in hand on the Capitals. Now, I'll say this: the way the Leafs are going, they're probably going to miss. The way the Panthers are going, that's still up in the air on what could happen with that team, especially if some of the rumors are true, or at least the talked about stuff that some of the insiders are discussing. We don't know that are true or not, and that Sergei Bobrovsky gets traded, because that could definitely be a game changer of what the Panthers are going to do moving forward and if they make the playoffs or not. So when you
Yeah,
look at the standings, what are your thoughts right now on the Capitals, especially the fact that of all these teams that I listed, the Capitals have no games in hand on any of them?
I think it's. I've said this online. I think it's too early to worry about games in hand because I think if the Cardinals do watch, if they had, if they, I was pointing out, if they get 30 or 40 points, they'll be at 99 points. 99 almost assuredly gets you in. If you're not very good, if they're at NHL 500 get 89 points, they're not going to get in because 91 has been the cutoff the last 2 years. The year before that was 94, and the year before that Washington was in between teams. I mean, I think the big thing you have to look at is probably the two teams that have the best chance of catching are the Bruins and the Penguins because they both have 2 games left against them. So obviously, even you could swing the points a lot your way. Islanders, I think, are a more consistent bunch. Islanders haven't lost, I believe, more than 2 games in a row all season long, so they're not very streaky. And even if they finish 500 ish, they still should have enough points to get in. Penguins are very hot and cold. They win. I think they believe they've won 6 in a row and lost 6 in a row this season. So, and obviously without Sidney Crosby, uh, they're vulnerable. Obviously, they played well against Vegas, but one of the things about Vegas is they have not been very good against playoff teams this year. I believe they won 4 playoff games against playoff teams all season long, so it's a little misleading, I think. But Boston, I think it sounds like they're going to try to add at the deadline, but it'll be interesting to see because last year they obviously did some selling and kind of crashed down the stretch, and then I think you'll see it this year that I'm some of these teams are a little bit over their heads, and can they survive these last 20, 25 games? It's always hard to say. But I mean, if I was to say, I think the Caps are still a pretty good shot to get in, but they have to finish strong. I think if they don't finish strong, they're not going to get in anyway. So, and I think the team, Bruins and the Penguins are probably the 2 teams that are more likely to be caught than say the Islanders or some of these other clubs.
And you had mentioned that the Caps have 2 games left with both of them. Obviously, for the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Caps and the Pens play April 11th and 12th in a home and home back to back, first in Pittsburgh, then in DC, which ends up being the Capitals' home finale. Um, and then for the Bruins, they're actually playing the Bruins this Saturday, the day after the trade deadline. And then they're taking on the Bruins the following Saturday, March 14th. So those 2 games, so they'll really be able to gauge if they're going to be able to catch the Bruins almost right away out of the gate coming out of the trade
Right.
deadline. Um, there's and this is kind of important in a way too, but the Philadelphia Flyers, there's 2 games left with them. This is a team who could potentially catch the Capitals. Keyword is potentially. Um, and that is both of those games are this month on March 11th and 31st. And again, it's a Metropolitan Division rivalry. So like those games are always like 4 point games for the division itself too. So if the Caps can get those points against the Flyers, that will help their case trying to, like as you said, try to catch the Pittsburgh Penguins in that case as well.
Well, the interesting thing too about the Bruins, 4 of their next 7 games are either against the Capitals or the Penguins. So we're going to know a lot about the Bruins' chances too, because if the Capitals end up winning some of these games in the next 2 weeks, they're going to gain ground on somebody. But if you end up losing these games, you're going to lose ground to somebody. But I think we'll see where the Bruins are going to end up pretty soon because as I said, in 2 weeks they're going to play more than half their schedules against teams that are directly fighting for spots. and the Bruins are obviously in a more precarious position because a lot of these other teams are closer to them than than either the Islanders or Penguins.
Yeah, and it should be noted, like obviously the biggest thing that a lot of people are focusing on is this game with the Utah Mammoth on Tuesday, the third, because it's the last game going into the trade deadline for the Capitals. The Caps are done for the rest of the week until Saturday when they go play the Boston Bruins in Boston. So, like I mentioned, they won the first game against Philadelphia coming out of the break. Then they beat Vegas, both two really good victories. Although the Vegas one, the Caps almost blew it in the third period. They
Yeah,
kind of took their foot off the gas in that one. And then they ended up getting completely blown out by Montreal, which credit to Spencer Carberry because people are going, oh, it's the second game of a back to back. And he goes, that excuse is just ass. These are professionals. I forget. Sammy Silver put up the full quote of what Carberry said, and pretty much he just pushed back on the whole notion. It's like it doesn't matter. Every team is playing back to backs, like at least 8 to 10 times this season. And there's a lot of teams who are very successful winning both games of their back to backs. The Caps have a back to back coming up next week between, in Philly than in Buffalo. So it's like the excuse of back to backs needs to kind of go away, but it still doesn't change the narrative. Okay, the Caps are 2-1 so far of these 4 games leading into the trade deadline. If they go 3-1, okay, now they're buyers. If they go 2-1 or 2-2 or 2-1-1, depending on how that result goes, do they become quasi sellers, quasi buyers? You know, that
I
that's
don't think I think I was going to say I think either way I think they're going to buy because I don't think the assets they have to trade the UFAs are not really going to bring a whole lot of return. You maybe get a couple of low draft picks, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to sell because guys like Sonny Milano, obviously he cleared waivers. You probably have to pay someone to take him, and some of these other UFAs they have are not really going to be attractive. Maybe the most attractive guy they would have to possibly deal would be a Charlie Lindgren, but they probably don't decide on backup goaltender over the summer. So I think they're going to end up buying. I mean, I think they've waited as long as they could for basically as long as they could for someone to come in and have the salary cap raised. But it's because basically they're going to have about 15 million in cap room, and I think it's just going to be I think they've been waiting to buy at some point, and I think they're going to buy. I don't think at this point when you're 2 points out of a playoff spot, people are always like, "Oh, you should sell, sell, sell." I mean, you look at the East this year; it's with outside Tampa Bay. There's not a lot of great teams out there. Some of the teams in playoff spots are not exactly teams you could see making a run. You talk about Pittsburgh. You've got a goaltending tandem of Silvos and Stuart Skinner, and that's not going to scare anybody. The Islanders, Hurricanes are probably the two best teams in the Metro, and the Islanders obviously are run by Matt Schaefer. His spectacular leader. In the Atlantic, you have Tampa Bay is really good, but even they got blown out. Buffalo's been hot, but that could continue. This is not a year where maybe if you're in the West, you sell because you're like, well, we have to get by Colorado, get by Dallas, we have to get by some of these other teams. This are like, you know, who really scares you in the East? Maybe Tampa. I don't think Carolina. They can get to the Eastern Final, but I like their setting is okay, but career AHL guy in net, how's he going to perform in net? We don't know. So I think when you're this, Florida, I was going to sell because I think they realize that the injuries have piled up, but I think they know they have a good core, and the team will probably look better next year. Toronto's obviously a disaster, and they're going to sell off. But I just don't. I can't see the Cap selling at this point. Maybe they're not as aggressive buyers as they may be, but I really don't think they're going to sell other than maybe trading a couple of UFAs and bringing someone else in.
So the bigger question is like you mentioned Charlie Lindgren. I was on the Dingers and Dashers podcast during the Olympic break. They brought up Charlie Lindgren. Do the Caps trade him? and I said, interestingly, Clay Stevenson is a UFA at the end of this season. Charlie Lindgren has 2 years left on his contract at 3 million per season, and so it's like it's a question, like you had said, over the summer they got to see what they're going to do. Do the Capitals maybe potentially re-sign Clay Stevenson and decide to bring him up to be, the new backup goalie to Logan Thompson, um, and trade Charlie Lindgren for potentially that top six forward? You know, I said, I don't see how they trade Lindgren right now at the deadline. There has been a lot of talk now. You and I have discussed this before. I've always seen Rasmus Sandin as the odd man out with Cole Hudson coming in. Now we're seeing reports that it's Trevor Van Riemsdyk, who is a UFA at the end of this season, as potentially the odd man out, being a trade bait or something like that. So it's kind of interesting to see what the Caps do. Obviously, Hendrix Lapierre is somebody that could probably use a fresh start someplace else, because while he's doing some of the right things, a lot of the stuff that we've been expecting him to do for years, he's still not doing it now. Um, so, but then it also begs the question: if you try to move, like, say, one of these UFAs, you have to move a defenseman because you got Cole Hudson coming up in the next near maybe by the end of this month potentially, depending on how his team does uh, for the remainder of their season. Who's out there that you can get? Because it doesn't feel like there's
Yeah,
a lot out there, not just in the trade market right now going into this deadline, but you're looking at a very thin, unrestricted free agent class coming July 1st, too.
yeah, no, it's. I mean, I think that's a big question too, because the rumor's always been Washington's going to get somebody with term, so in case they miss the playoffs this year, they're going to have someone signed for next year. And like you said, part of that I think is the reason is the crop of players. I mean, I think the one team being good that probably is going to hurt a lot of buyers is Buffalo, because I think there was a lot of players the Sabres have that other teams would have coveted, but obviously they're not going to be selling at all at this point. Maybe I think the line between buyers and sellers is becoming pretty clear. I think in the East, pretty much everybody but Washington and Columbus, maybe that's out of the playoff picture, is going to be sellers. The West, I think, is a little bit more murky, but I think you pretty much know by this point who's going to be trading off players and who isn't. Uh, Goal wise, I think the Caps are going to decide over the summer what they're going to do with Lindgren. Stevenson will probably not. He's got one more year left before he's a UFA.
Oh, so
So
he's restricted free
basically,
agent. Okay,
they
yeah.
right. No, well, this is his third year of his third-year deal
Oh, okay.
next year. So he's got one more year left. Then he's a UFA. But I think what will happen is, obviously, if they decide to make him the backup, they'll extend him post, after July 1st. But I think the expectation is he probably wouldn't clear waivers again. So I think the Caps are going to have to decide which their backup goaltender is going to be. But I think that comes over the summer. I mean, this year, if you aspirations, you're probably not trading your backup goaltender. So I think they will see what he does the remainder of the year and then kind of go from there. Maybe you could trade Lindgren at least to get some, pay someone to get him off your payroll like they did with Darcy Kemper. But Washington, a top six forward, probably another depth forward for injury to top, get a defensive depth for insurance if they need it. If they, the thing with Hudson is he may be available in mid March. BU is probably not making the tournament, but for some reason to make a run, then he may be available until the end of the regular season. So you kind of have to plan that he's not going to be available until maybe the last week of the regular season, and then go from there. Most likely he will be, but the way the tournament works, you can't, and they won't know until next week when how long the season is going to go on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the one thing about the Caps, like people always ask me about trade rumors involving them. 99% of the rumors involving Washington don't come from Washington themselves. They're very quiet about who they're trying to acquire. Uh, they do not broadcast. I know during the Quinn Hughes trade talks, which after the fact they were debunked. They were very upset that particular names got linked to that trade, which was, at the end was more of a speculation than anything. It did not come to the Caps, and they were very upset. So they will not say, I think you pretty much touched on who was available. I think, they make a trade. It's going to be at least one of their two first picks from the next two seasons. I think you would probably see, Sandin, I think, may have kind of played his way back into the roster, although, he's probably the kind of player that a team would covet, to get a quote NHL ready player back. Sonny Milano could be a salary cap relief type of guy to get something off payroll. But you never know. As I said, it's you'll have maybe one of the Hershey prospects. I don't think you'll see Chris Stahl or Protus moved. You won't see Hudson move, but you may see someone else off that roster. Maybe they entertain offers for Stevenson, but I think they like him and they want to go forward. I think more likely he's the backup next year than them trading with the deadline.
Yeah, and not only that, but I know the Caps are very high on Garen Bjorklund too, and they probably want to see him be a little bit more of that number one guy in Hershey next year as well, especially now that they've just re-signed Mitch Gibson for another 2 years, so he'll probably be more of a backup to Bjorklund in Hershey next season. Which then leads me to this next question: if you're going to trade a goalie, Charlie Lindgren or Clay Stevenson, who do you think brings in the better haul, in terms of a trade?
Um, it's hard to say because well, I guess I mean Stevenson is probably more attractive, but then again, he's going to be a UFA next year. You probably would have to have some. He's making minimum this season, next season, but the year after that, obviously, if he's going to be your top two, he'll make a couple mil. Uh, Lindgren obviously was really good 2 years ago, but has not been quite as good this year. So, but I mean, he's still a veteran goalie. I think I don't think either of them bring a ton of them. You'll probably, if they're traded, it'll probably be part bigger package. I think I could see if they get a top six, they probably would send a first rounder, a guy off the roster, which could be a guy like TVR, it could be Sandin, it could be Milano, depending on what the money situation is, and then probably a guy from Hershey. Maybe you have another pick in there somewhere. But I think it'd be more of a package than rather one for one. I think teams that'll sell, they always want a guy they could roll out the lineup next game. So they say, hey, look, we got someone who's useful now. But then you'll see the first rounder and you'll see guy they'll put in the system. So, but yeah, no, I would expect. I think with the cap room they have, I would be, they were very quiet this offseason after the previous season where they're very very active, and they had 15 million. I don't think they let that sit. And as I said, I don't believe they'll be sellers at all at this point, just because I don't think, the teams in front of them are not particularly daunting. I think the conference is not particularly daunting. So even, every team in the East is pretty much flawed. And, if you make the right ads, obviously they just got Dubois back, who's been a big, they're 3-1 since he returned to the lineup. And that was a big hole. They had a hole at center pretty much all season long with them out of the lineup. So I think they're willing to give it a go with a little bit deeper of a lineup than they've had the previous 40 some games.
Yeah, and my question was just more in general of just those two, of Stevenson or Lindgren, just simply because of the fact that, that's what the debate's going to come down to eventually. Which guy are you going to end up keeping and what can you get for the other that you decide not to keep at the end of the day, whether it's now at the deadline or over the summer. Um, but then,
Right.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, plus you got to remember that, Lynn's, 34 years old is, Stevenson's 27. So I think you're basically buying the back end of he's going to be almost 36 at the time his contract is up. So, and that's all goaltender skilled to still get that. Whereas Lynn is prime. Like I said, I think it's eventually the Caps making it, but I do not think it's going to be. It may be at the deadline, but I would think if he's going to get moved, it's going to be over the summer at the draft, just because I think you're not necessarily, because what happens if Steven gets hurt on the stretch? You basically have no insurance. Then you're basically hoping, you're pinning your hopes on Thompson staying healthy. And I think if you're serious about the cup or making a run, you're not gonna take that leap now. You're gonna take that leap later.
Yeah. And then the next one that comes up on this list that there's a lot of discussion on is John Carlson. Currently out right now due to injury. He's still listed as day to day. He has not been cleared for contact as he's been wearing the non contact jersey. Is in the last year of his contract. There has been talk about potential extension for him. The only thing, and I said this on the Dingers and Dashers podcast, the only reason I could see the Caps re signing him for, say, 2 to 3 years max. I would not do anything more than three. Realistically, two is that sweet spot number, in my opinion, on John Carlson, is to be a mentor to Cole Hudson. That's how I would see that. But at the same time, do the Capitals need John Carlson move past
I
this
mean,
season? Like it's a very interesting situation that the Capitals have with Carlson.
I think we talked about this earlier this season, just about how usually the Caps end up re-signing their own very early in the year. Backstrom, I believe his last contract was pretty early in the season. Obviously before this year, Ovi was very early in the season. They're pretty deliberate about keeping these guys around, and I think Carlson's one of those interesting. He was very good the first half of last season, and then by the Carolina series, he was pretty much immobile. And I know he insisted he wasn't hurt, but he could hardly defend. Carolina just ended up running around him. And so I was curious this year. And then, obviously there's been talk about it. I think if Carlson stays, I think he's going to have to take a team friendly contract, because I can't see giving him a significant contract at this point. I think he's a decent defenseman, but certainly someone they can replace really fairly easily. They don't have to give him a lot of money. So I think if he takes a team friendly contract, he comes back. He may be reluctant to do that, because I think, I think he values his contributions. And if you want to talk about the Olympic team, obviously it's a big disappointment for him not to be invited to the Olympics this year. Because obviously he was a big hero for the 2010 World Juniors team. He had played on some of the international teams, but he never, he didn't get the shot at the Olympics this year because he was just falling down the depth chart. And I think, it's not a secret that he's not what he was. I think maybe if he signs, it's got to be team friendly. It's maybe a year or two, and that's max. I probably would, if not for his history with the team, I probably would think they just move on from him, because I don't know what he has left, and I don't know what I would put. Maybe if he's going to take maybe 2 or 3 million a year, fine. You have him as a depth guy, insurance, fine. But he can't make what he makes now going forward, because I don't think he brings that value near that value to the table.
Yeah, and a very good comparable for Carlson would be Carl Alsner, his former defensive partner. You know, when Alsner left the Capitals, went to Montreal, he signed like what was it, a 4 or 5 year contract with Montreal? Didn't even finish the contract.
Mm-hmm.
Was bought out, I think, after the
Right.
second year. So, because Alsner, just was too slow for the speed of the game when he left the Caps. And it was showing when he was with the Capitals too. And we loved Carl Alsner. I think the Alsner Carlson defensive pairing was a great pairing for when it was. But it's just a very interesting notion that you mentioned like the Caps are very deliberate on signing their guys early on. Another guy who has not signed and is in the last year of his contract that a lot of people are actually not talking about is Brandon Duhaime, which is a very well liked player in the locker room and stuff like that. But he's also somebody who doesn't stick around places for very long either. Just being realistic here. Um, what are your thoughts on Duhaime? And is that somebody who maybe a younger guy comes in and takes his spot like an Ilya Protas or an Andrew Cristall?
I think his fate will probably depend on how this team does the rest of the season. I think, obviously, like I was saying, they're going to have they have about 15 million to spend this year. The cap is going to go up next year. So you got to, obviously the one guy that is a big question mark in terms of salary cap is going to be Ovechkin, what he does. Because, I'm kind of inclined to think he's coming back at some point. I don't know if he's going to take a team friendly contract to come back if he does. I think obviously if they need changes this summer, I don't think he'll stick around. But I think if they like what this team does here, and like I said, it's a long way to go. Because I mean, I already see people like, oh, they should just sell on the season. It's like, they're 2 points out of a playoff spot. The money you bring in just making the playoffs is not going to encourage teams because you know, 1 to 2 per game in revenue without paying team salaries in the playoffs, which is why teams want to do it. If you're a borderline team, you're going to go for it because, going a couple rounds in the playoffs, you probably go from being in the red to the black in terms of ticket revenue. So, and like I said, this year is it's a very open season. It's not a year where it's going to be daunting to get to the third round. Perhaps, you know, third round is probably the ceiling of where the Caps can go, but some years it would probably be one round and then maybe you pull the plug. But, is it really, if they end up in the 2-3 of the Metro, is that really going to be that daunting a task to take on? They match up decently well against the Islanders, probably match up very well against the Penguins. And so either way, maybe if you end up in the wild card, if you're facing the Atlantic, that's a little bit more daunting. But if you're facing Carolina, obviously Carolina's not the best draw for them, but they're not unbeatable either.
Yeah. But you mentioned Ovechkin, and there was a very interesting thing that we saw uh, coming out of the Olympic break. And that was at the Capital One Arena, or as we now jokingly call it, the unnamed arena, since the name has come down for the renovations. Um, Something that was missing for a while has been the Ovechkin goal counter, which is where Slapshot usually stands when he beats the drum. That is back now. So after Ovechkin scored 900, they left it up for like his OV 900 celebration thing, and then they took it down, and it had been gone ever since. And then it came back, for the game against the Flyers, and it's going to be up, I guess, from what I've heard, for the remainder of this season. Um, I asked the staff members about it, and I said, "Hey, is there a reason that the goal counter's back up?" And their line was, "Well, he's still scoring goals." And some of us kind of joked, "Well, is he kind of?" Because before Saturday night, when he got the 2 goals against Montreal, he hadn't been really doing much. Um, so my inkling is, and you say he's going to be back next season. It's just a matter of
Yeah,
when
I
is that.
would,
It's just a matter of when that decision's made.
right.
My gut still says this is it, and we probably, and like I originally said, we'll find out coming out of the Olympics. Obviously, that's not the case. I think we might find out the Gretzky style, which is the week before the end of the season, like the way Wayne Gretzky did it. I think that home game against Pittsburgh on April 12th is the last regular season game that Ovechkin plays because he won't play in Columbus a few days later. So that's just still my gut on the situation because the goal
Well,
counters back in the arena. It's just, I don't know.
well, I told you back in October, I said there are three things were going to happen with Ovechkin. One is he happy with his play. I mean, I think even though he doesn't really pass the eye test anymore, he's still, among the team leader in goals and points. So it's not that statistically has not had a bad season.
He has
Is the
24
team competitive?
goals. He has 24 goals, 26 assists, 50 points for first on the team. He's
Right.
tied and then the only person behind him, or the only two people behind him in goals, is Wilson with 23 and Chikrin with 22. Both guys also have 26 points for 49 and 48 respectively. So Ovi is at the top, like you just mentioned there.
Right. I mean, like I said, I think if his personal numbers went down, I think you would see him ponder going away. I think the Capitals are competitive either this year and next year. And the other note I will say about the Cap next year, right now they have 36 million to spend for next season. because the cap's going up to 104. So with the contracts that are coming off the books, Ovechkin's included, that's a significant amount of space to redo your roster if you want to. And three, is he getting the ice time? Yes, he's getting the ice time. I mean, I don't think anyone can argue that Ovechkin is being his ice time isn't quite the same as it has been, but probably to their detriment, he's playing a ton of their power plays still, even though the power play has been terrible. So I mean, I really don't think, you know, unless there's like an X factor, like his wife wants to go back. But and I know people talking about, oh, he always talks about playing his last years with Moscow Dynamo. He said this since like his third year. He's going to spend his last year in Moscow. So this is not new news. So I think, to me, it would just be a surprise if you walk away when you're still productive at the NH. Because, I mean, you look who's leading the KHL in scoring. It's former Hershey farmhand Samana from Maryland. The KHL, he could put up monster numbers. He's way better than that league. He knows that too, and I think he's still good at this level. Like I said, the eye test isn't great, but he's putting up points, and it's hard to argue with production. The team is still competitive. I mean, obviously they're not as competitive as they were last year, but you have a way to remake the roster. And don't forget too, he can use this as leverage for them to build the roster next year. Said, I'll come back if you get this, this, and this. That's a way. I think if he would have retired, he would have said by now. I kind of gave him the Olympic break. I thought if he was going to walk away, he was going to say at the Olympic break, and he hasn't. So I think you'll hem and haw. You probably won't know at the end of the year, but I think he at least has a 1-year deal. I could even see a 2-year deal at some point. But unless he's lived up to the criteria he had, I believe going into the season, the team has been competitive enough that I don't think he'd walk away from a competitive roster. I mean, remember when he first signed this contract, everyone said, "Oh, by the end they're going to be rebuilding. He'll be happy to walk away." They're not rebuilding. They're getting a couple good players coming in. Obviously Ryan Leonard has been decent this year. Uh, Hudson will be a very good defenseman, and they'll get a little bit younger. And so I would be surprised if he walked away. I don't think it's impossible he walks away, but I would basically think that he's at least coming back for one more year.
Yeah, I just it's hard to read him. And you mentioned his wife. Over the summer, she made the comments that this is it, and you know the saying, "Happy wife, happy life." Um, so like some people may think that she may have already played his hand a little bit there by saying those comments and having him go public. But we'll see. It's like the greatest mystery. Like it's interesting. We just got our season ticket renewal emails, and there's like 2/3 of the emails about this stupid Halo thing that they're building between the second and third levels. And it's like most of us real hockey fans don't care about that crap. We don't want to be away from our seats when the game is actually happening. That's the experience. The experience is watching the game, not stuffing our faces in some sweet level thing, and watching it on TV. So if I want to watch it on TV, I'll just stay home. But they spent 2/3 of it on that, and if I remember right from last year's email, they were talking about, oh, how great the 50th anniversary was, and Ovechkin breaking the record, and really hyping up that this could be Ovechkin's last season. And then like that little third that's about the Caps itself and not about the renovations to the arena, they don't even talk about Ovechkin. They don't talk about the leaps and bounds of like what could be next season with this team. It's just such a radio silence, and it's very it makes you think, and it makes you
Well, I mean,
ponder about it.
the thing is, that contractually can't say anything if he's not under contract because you can't promise Ovechkin if he's not there.
Well, yeah,
Technically
obviously.
until he's signed. And that's the thing. Just and there's going to be. I think someone was pointing out this week that the tickets for that last game against Columbus are starting to spike because I think people are, they don't necessarily know, but they don't know if he's coming back. So I think you're going to see a little bit of that as the season goes down. But I think there's going to be rumors, and as I said, they don't until they know, they won't know. If he's going to be there next year. But
Well, well,
I
even
just
well, even then, it's like you don't have to mention Ovechkin. You could just say, "Oh, you can easily just mark it off of Tom Wilson and Logan Thompson, like the two of the
right.
most popular guys that are on this team right now, or Chikrin." It's like you could still pump up the team instead of just going, barely even mentioning the team that you're renewing your season tickets for. Like you gotta mention something
Yeah.
about your
Well, I mean,
team.
but the thing is, Ovechkin's been such a driver for tickets as long as he's been here. Merchandise, and it's just, they're so used to it. And the last couple of years with the Chase, it's the same thing. And I'm sure they would like to know, but in the short term, it's probably better that they don't know because then they can spike the interest for this last game against Columbus or Pittsburgh. I'm sorry. They could say, well, you know, it,
Yes. So, but yeah, but and I have also seen it too, where the tickets have been spiking in price for both
they
Pittsburgh games as well. Um, so it's made it definitely very interesting in
just
that perspective. And Starkey is currently frozen. I know he's having some Wi-Fi issues, so hopefully we'll get Starkey back. But no, but to Starkey's point, the game against Columbus at the end of the season, the prices have gone up. The prices in Pittsburgh and for the game against Pittsburgh here in DC have gone up as well. So so yeah, it's I think we have officially lost Ted Starkey, which is not the way we want to end a show, but I do know he had mentioned that he had lost his internet earlier in the day today, and that the that he was on a mobile hotspot for the podcast. So with that, what we're gonna do, you can follow Ted Starkey on social media. Just look up Ted Starkey. You see his name right there on the screen. We always have him there. He writes for Hockey Hot Stove. Um, and as always, the More Phenomenal Hockey Show is brought to you by Oats Overnight. And when we're on the go but still need breakfast, Oats Overnight is the healthy on the go breakfast choice for the show and TXHT Hockey. Use our exclusive link in the description on both txhthockey.com and in the YouTube show description to get a $20 discount on Oats Overnight today. So, with that, sorry for losing our guest near the end of the episode. We kind of figured this might have happened. But thanks for tuning in, and we will see you after the trade deadline.